Yeah.
Principal. Oh, you were principal.
Is that?
No, I was on, wasn't it? I'll turn around.
Yeah. I check on the.
That's the house. Oh, you know what? There's a big problem here. You'll be there one day, Rich. Rich.
It's always the little stuff that gets us.
The stuff that's obvious.
Yeah.
Like,
Don't think about it. You think so naturally.
so this is Mike. Are we on Mike? Is Mike on?
You can hear. I turned on these.
We're off.
No,
We're off here, so
no. You probably can hear the mic is not on. Your mic.
here. Kurt, you wanna listen, Sam? What are you on, line or mic?
This is line down here, and I'm on line. I've been doing all.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I hear it too. You hearing that?
Let's see. Okay, I don't know what they're so this ain't out right.
Your own device.
I got a lock here.
Oh, here. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, there you go.
I just forgot how to do it. It's been a while.
There you go.
Thanks.
You split it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. My back is killing me, but I got it in my thing there. What do you need? Turn around. Or a splitter. You just need a splitter. Yeah. care to check?
Let me check see if it's.
Do you have sound now?
Cool.
Check 1 2. Yeah, I'm hearing it. You hear it? It's online.
Testing 1 2. Test test test. Test 1 2. Test.
The meeting of the Accountability and Administrative Review Committee is now in session. We're going to start as a subcommittee. Members, I know, are in appropriations at least, and there's a couple of other hearings going on. So we will go ahead and commence as a subcommittee and work our way through today's hearing. The topic today is the sale of state buildings. Interestingly, this is the first public vetting of a very significant issue, selling 11 important buildings that house functions such as the state Supreme Court, which is ironic enough as it is that you're selling the Supreme Court, and the agency charged with responding to disasters, CalEMA. There, until now, has not been a thorough cost-benefit analysis of these proposed sales. The administration provided one-sentence warning of potential rent costs in its proposal to the legislature last July, out of 5 paragraphs that delineated this major policy shift. In the legislation itself, this item was on page 7 of an 11-page bill. Most of that bill was dedicated to the Orange County Fairgrounds, which, as we know now, the proposed sale came in at half the anticipated price for that property, and that sale is not proceeding. A more thorough cost-benefit analysis might have led to a more thoughtful proposal that would pencil out better in the long term. The fundamental deal here is whether we get short-term money to deal with our budget crisis now, or long-term cost over 20, 30 years, long after this administration is gone. And our obligation isn't just to get the quick fix for this year's budget. Our obligation is to think about the taxpayers over the long run and make sure that they have the best value for their tax dollars. This sale would reverse nearly 4 decades of state policy that found that owning buildings was better for taxpayers. We are on the verge of losing control of more than 5.6 million square feet of office space if this proposal were to be followed through on. Unfortunately, this is a case where there has not been the transparency and accountability that we expect in our state government. And that is what this committee is set up to do. We are a permanent oversight committee. We are tasked with finding out what is in the best interest of the taxpayers and trying to find efficiencies and savings wherever we can, and not just rubber stamping proposals from the administration. So we are here to do that task today. I'm very glad that we have the LAO to start us off. They have done an analysis which the members have entitled, "Should the State Sell Its Office Buildings?" And we will get an overview by Mark Whitaker from the LAO's office. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Good morning. Mark Whitaker, the Legislative Analyst Office. As the chair pointed out, I'll be discussing our report today and referring to it throughout my presentation. Just to give the main background, the sale leaseback was approved in legislation last year that authorized the Department of General Services to sell and then lease back the 11 state office properties shown on page 5 of our report. There are a number of reports out there that there's 17 buildings or 23 buildings or 11. What it really comes down to is there's 11 separate properties. Some of the properties have more than one building on them, so that's why you'll see some reports that there are more than 11. But essentially, it comes down to these main 11 properties. The legislation delegated almost all of the authority for the sale to the Department of General Services to determine the lease terms, what was in the best interest of the state, to do the bidding process and select the bids and the buyer they would want to sell to. Significantly, the legislation does not require DGS to sell the properties, similar to the Orange County Fairgrounds, if the administration felt that bids came in too low or they no longer wanted to go through with the sale. They would be able to stop it. And then as far as the role of the legislature going forward, the legislation has a 30-day review period where before committing to a deal or a sale, the Department of General Services must provide a report to the legislature 30 days before signing any agreement that outlines the terms of the deal and their analysis of how it might pencil out. So that's the main reason that our office went ahead and did this report. There have been a lot of questions about, is this a good deal for the state of California? And we thought it would be a good opportunity before that 30-day review period to provide this committee and the entire legislature with a good view of what the revenue and long-term cost implications might be. Just to summarize the progress so far on the sale leaseback, DGS went ahead through a competitive bid process and selected a broker, CB Richard Ellis, to help market and go through with the sale. So far, they accepted initial bids earlier this month and are going through those bids and selecting the best of those initial bids to participate in a best and final round in an attempt to single out a buyer for the properties. Once that buyer is selected, we imagine they would send a letter and a report to the legislature to start that 30-day review period before any sale is finalized. In the report, what we attempt to do is measure the fiscal impact of the sale leaseback. And as the chair pointed out, there's really two main considerations. On the one hand, you're going to get a significant amount of one-time revenue in the budget year to help with the state's budgetary shortfall. But in the long run, over the next 20 to 50 years, the state would be paying lease costs to lease these buildings back. That would be quite expensive over time. So looking first at just what you can expect in terms of one-time revenue from the sale. First of all, we still have some outstanding bonds on some of these properties. So the first proceeds from the sale would need to go to sell off those bonds. The estimate is that there's about $1.1 billion in outstanding bonds. So what that means then is, for example, the governor has estimated in his budget one-time revenue of approximately $598 million. So that would assume a sales price of approximately $1.7 billion, take away the $1.1 billion to pay off the lease revenue bonds, and you get approximately $600 million in a one-time benefit to the general fund in 2010-11. The revenue the governor assumes, that $598 million, was assumed in the budget and was adopted by the legislature during the most recent special session. So as we go forward, if the sale does not go through or the legislature chooses to stop it, that would essentially add another $600 million to the budget problem. $600 million in already adopted solutions would disappear. The governor's estimate of $598 million, $600 million approximately, in our report we found that this was probably too low and should is probably the minimum the state should expect from selling the buildings. We had a more optimistic scenario that would suggest that the state could receive as much as $1.4 billion in a one-time benefit from selling these buildings. That may sound surprising, but given the nature of the sale leaseback, this transaction is much different than traditional asset sales, and we think investors will find the buildings quite attractive. Compared to other buildings on the market, which now, due to the recession, have high vacancy rates and are getting low values, this transaction will look quite attractive because essentially the new owner would be guaranteed at least 20 years of 100% occupancy and full lease payments with extensions up to 50 years. So we expected a fairly competitive bidding environment, and according to reports last week by DGS, that's proved quite true as the initial bids came in. Some initial bids came in above $2 billion, which would already suggest that the governor's revenue estimate is no longer in play, and that the one-time benefit to the state would be at least $900 million going forward, or higher, depending on where the bids come in. These numbers are summarized in Figure 3 on page 9. It just shows the two scenarios. The revenue assumption in the governor's budget would be a $1.7 billion sale with approximately $600 million in net proceeds to the general fund. Our more optimistic scenario, purchase price of around $2.5 billion with net proceeds of $1.4 billion. So a significant amount of revenue to help with the state's budgetary shortfall. But on the other hand, you would have the increased annual cost of leasing the buildings compared to owning them. By our estimates, the leasing cost over the life of the buildings would be much higher than what the state would pay to own the buildings. And you can see this in the graph on page 10. The top line shows our estimate for what the lease cost would be under the sale leaseback over a 35-year period. The proposed lease terms are summarized on page 11, but essentially, as you can see from the line, the proposed lease terms would include a 10% increase in the rent every 5 years, so that's why the line kind of steps up over time. In addition, the state would pay increases in the new owner's operating costs as measured by inflation, so there's a slight upward trend there as well. The original rents, the base market rent, would be based near current market rents and would basically just increase as outlined in the lease. The only other maybe important thing about the lease is that the initial term would be 20 years. After those 20 years, the state would have the option to renew the lease at 5-year intervals up to 50 years, so six renewal terms. And that would be under the same terms, so you'd still have that 10% increase every 5 years. The bottom line, on the other hand, shows our estimate for the state's cost of continuing to own the buildings. And that line trends down for the first 20 years or so, mainly because as the state pays off the bonds remaining on each of these buildings, those debt service costs would disappear and the cost of owning those buildings would decrease. So we tried not to understate the risk of owning the buildings and tried to build in some extra costs for kind of emergency repairs and maintenance and things that would be expected as the buildings age. So we hope this is a realistic estimate, but obviously there are a lot of unknowns into what may happen with these buildings over time. But in general, I mean, I think this graph shows a pretty good idea of the effect of the sale leaseback. You have the one option of owning the buildings, which would slightly decrease the state's structural budget problem over time as the cost of owning the buildings would decrease. Whereas under the sale leaseback, we would see the cost of owning the buildings steadily increase and adding to the state's structural problem. The difference is very small in the first few years, averaging only around $35 million a year, the difference in costs, but it would continue to grow in the out years to upwards of $200 million annually more to lease the buildings than own them. One important caveat on this is in the first year, we estimate that the cost of leasing would be about $30 million more than owning, but that assumes that as of July 1st, the sale is complete and the state is completely, divested from these buildings. Realistically, it's probably not going to happen that way. There are a number of employees in these buildings who, in order for the state to realize any of the cost savings of selling the buildings, would need to be laid off, transferred, PYs reduced, and all those things. So to the extent that won't happen immediately, but will take a few months, we would expect the cost in the first year to be a little greater going forward. So the overall fiscal analysis then is to put these two things together and compare how does this one-time revenue that the state could get, which we estimate could be as high as $1.4 billion, how does that compare to these costs over time? And does it pencil out as a good deal for the state? We found that the answer to that is no, that looking over 35 years, the cost of leasing the buildings back would outweigh the benefits of that one-time revenue. And this is summarized in Figure 7 on page 15. We have our two scenarios there. One is the governor's sale price, which, as I've said, is probably already considered too low. But you can see just there, we had a one-time revenue estimate of $600 million. Over 35 years, the cost of leasing the buildings, we estimated would be about $5.5 billion greater than the cost of owning. But of course, we had to convert that into present value because the dollars 35 years from now are worth much less than $1 today. And so in net present value terms, that cost differential is about $2.1 billion. So you compare the $2.1 billion net present value of the sale leaseback to the $600 million in one-time revenue, and we estimated that it would cost the state approximately $1.5 billion more over 35 years to do the sale leaseback. The scenario looks not much better, but a little better under our more optimistic sale price, where you would get the $1.4 billion in one-time revenue, and that would compare to $1.9 billion in the cost of leasing the buildings back for a net cost of the state of around $600 million. Doesn't pencil out exactly because there's some rounding. The total's not necessarily total correctly due to rounding, but it's around $600 million over 35 years. The last column there, just to kind of put these costs in perspective, we decided to show you the effective interest rate, which is a way to think about this transaction. Think of the one-time revenue as a loan, and the lease payments over time as the payments to pay back that loan, and that would be an effective interest rate of around 7.1% to 14.3%. So fairly high interest rates, and say unlike a mortgage or what else, at the end of that 35 years, you don't own these buildings. They would still be owned by the purchaser. In the report, we recognize that these results are sensitive to a number of factors. Some of the major factors are there are a lot of unknowns about what costs the state might incur if it continued to own the buildings. And like I said, we tried not to understate that. They're sensitive to the time period you use. We felt 35 years was a good time period to use because it represents, in our view, a good usable life for the buildings, and recognizes the fact that after 20 years, the state is very likely to renew these leases because this is a significant amount of square feet. We imagine in 20 years, the state will still be here. It will still have office workers and still have a need for these buildings. So it wouldn't make sense to stop right at 20 years. But obviously, if you did stop the analysis at 20 years, the deal would look much better because those costs in years 20 to 35 wouldn't come into play. So that's one factor to consider. The other factor is the time value of money. To the extent that you value, money, the revenues this year versus costs in 35 years. If you place a higher value on revenues today, that could change the net present value and our analysis. So putting this all together, our main recommendation from this, and the main takeaway, is that this does not represent good fiscal policy and good budgeting practice. The state is attempting to find one-time revenues to meet current operating expenses and meet the current budgetary shortfall that will increase expenditures in the out years. So I think in normal fiscal times, we would absolutely recommend against this. But recognizing the difficulties the state is having now in balancing its budget and the other options that are presented before you to balance the budget, we recognize this is just one imperfect option among many. We would strongly consider, given the costs involved in the out years, that you try as many other alternatives as you can. And especially if the revenues come in low, we've already expected they won't be as low as the governor's estimate, but to the extent that they are low, that would be even more reason to attempt to reject the sale. So going forward, the way this could play out, obviously, there's a number of different scenarios similar to the Orange County Fairgrounds. Maybe the administration could decide that the bids are too low and never present the deal to the legislature and just stop the sale themselves. But it's also likely that the DGS will choose a buyer and submit the letter for review by the legislature. And all the numbers in our report are just preliminary numbers, so we recommend that at that time we'll know for certain what the sale price is. We might have a better idea of what the out-year cost and the lease terms might be, and that would be a good opportunity both for DGS to present an analysis of the revenue and costs over time, for our office to perhaps do another analysis, and for the legislature to consider through perhaps the budget process whether they want to direct the administration to continue with the sale. So that's kind of all I have to say, and I'll be happy to answer questions on the report.
Thank you. Before we get to questions, I did want to acknowledge, the fact that there are some cameras here, and because we're all about transparency and letting people know what's going on. I just want to identify that we do have ABC News Channel 7, KCRA Channel 3, Capital News Television Service, and CBS 13. That's the cameras that are in the room now, just to make sure that everybody's clear who is in the room, because sometimes people show up and we don't know who they are. And then the Associated Press has a photographer here as well. It's going to be a practice of mine in all of my hearings when we have cameras to identify who they are so that people know that it is the media that is here and not any other entity. With that, I think Assemblymember Berryhill, you have some questions?
Yeah, I do. And thanks for coming here today, Mark. This has been a very controversial issue over a number of years. As you were talking, I kept writing down more and more questions here, so I got a couple of them for you. First one, just kind of an observation. It seems to me you said this was going to cost us about $600 million over 35 years. Couldn't you make the argument that if you can front load this thing and pay this debt way down, if we could get some budget reform in there so we couldn't start just throwing the money away, that might not be that bad of a deal business-wise?
Well, I think that's why we tried to include the effective interest rate to show that even at these numbers, you're looking at essentially kind of a borrowing cost of above 7%, which we don't think is necessarily ideal. It's better than some of the lower revenue assumptions where it would be in double digits effective interest rate. But certainly, I mean, we would recommend reforms and solutions that are lasting and actually cut into the structural deficit as opposed to solutions such as this that are one-time and add to it.
So you said that the original sale of these buildings would be at about $2 billion?
The initial bids that DGS received in the middle of this month, they reported that they received multiple bids above $2 billion. So our optimistic estimate is a sale price of $2.5 billion. So based on what DGS has reported in our scenario, you could expect a sale price between $2 and $2.5 billion. I have not seen the bids that DGS received. It could be that they were very close to $2 billion. It could be that they were closer to $3 billion. All they've said was that it was over $2 billion.
Yeah, I'm curious. You know, in today's economic times, you can certainly make the argument that, my gosh, you'll sell these buildings at 50 cents on the dollar, which would be a very bad deal. But given the fact that you mentioned that this is 100% occupancy, this is a pretty good deal for a business guy to go in there and do that. Would this be, let me turn this thing off. At 2.5, I mean, can we expect, as this economy gets better, could we expect this 2.5 billion to go higher, or is this higher than what the average economic expectation could be right now?
I think certainly if the economy improves, you could see higher sale prices. Certainly if you had tried to sell these buildings a few years ago or 3 or 4 years ago at kind of the height of the market, right, the sale price would have been higher. The one consideration you have to factor in is that we're also leasing these buildings back. So to the extent that the economy is doing really well, the market rents that the state would agree to pay as part of the lease would be higher. So certainly we're not getting the upfront one-time revenue that we would have got a few years ago, but the state is also not going to have to pay the higher rents that they would have if they had leased these buildings a few years ago. We're going to be able to lock in slightly lower rents than we would have at a peak of the market. Yeah,
this whole deal of selling assets right now, we don't have budget reform, in my opinion. I mean, we're rewarding bad behavior. And at least at this point in time, I think selling any of these assets in these economic times, if we don't have some safeguards down the road so we don't just spend it all on programs that we can't sustain, we're just kicking the can down the road a little bit longer. And so I'd be a little reluctant to go along with selling anything at this point in time.
Thank you. We have a quorum, so before we move to Joan, please call the roll.
De la Torre.
Here.
Strickland. Arambula. Here. Berryhill. Here. Block. Here. Buchanan. Here. Caballero. Here. Emerson. Here. Fletcher. Huber. Jones. Lowenthal. Here. Perez. Valines.
Okay, we have a quorum. Assemblymember Buchanan.
Thank you. When I look at your charts, I mean, pretty much on day one, we're paying more to lease back than if we continue to own, correct?
Yes.
So it's not just a matter of how much we save over 20 or 35 years. We start paying more next year to lease back these buildings
Yeah,
than if we continue to own them.
right. I mean, we estimate that in the first year it would cost at least $30 million more to lease them than to own them. Now, of course, also in the first year you'd have that one-time revenue, so that first year would be much.
So if we take that one-time revenue and we use it to offset some of the potential cuts we may have to make, what happens in 2011-12?
I think that's exactly our argument for why this is not necessarily the best budgeting practice. Is if there are not other solutions, if the economy does not improve, it could very well be that programs or you're protecting this year might have to be cut next year, or revenue increases that you don't enact this year would have to just be enacted next year. So certainly this doesn't solve the state's underlying problem.
And I think when the budget reforms that we're taking a look at really talk about what families and local governments and school districts, the good budgeting practices we do for years. You take ongoing revenue and spend it for ongoing expenses, and one-time revenue and spend it for one-time expenses. And the idea that you can get a one-time realization of income from this and solve a structural ongoing problem with the budget is foolish. And so when I take a look at it, selling when the market's low, incurring increased ongoing costs from day one, it just does not make any sense to me. All we're doing is kicking the can down the road and not dealing with the structural budget issues that we've been doing for years now, which is why one reason why we're in this situation. I mean, we certainly know that the financial crisis and the subprime mortgage debacle has wreaked havoc on our state budget, but at the same time, we've been borrowing for years. The voters approved a $15 billion bond in April 2004 that the governor asked us to pass to pay off our debt and balance the budget and tear up the credit card, and we didn't do that. So this type of borrowing to me is penny wise and pound foolish. And, whether we sell it at $2 billion or $2.5 billion, I just don't see where there's any long-term benefit to the state, and I think it continues the same kind of budgeting practices that have gotten us into this trouble.
Thank you. I have two questions. If we're at whatever price, we're getting some money this one year, do you expect that we will have that money before July 1st?
That would probably be a better question for DGS, but I don't think it would be the transaction would be complete that soon. At the earliest, they would select a final buyer by the end of May. So to the extent there would be some due diligence period, to the extent the legislature would have its 30-day review period, and all of those closing arrangements, I would expect sometime later in the year.
Okay. So this fiscal year, which is where this dollar amount is programmed, is gone, June 30th. So whatever money is realized will be in the next fiscal year.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I mischaracterized it earlier. The budget's the revenue from the sale was included in the governor's proposal for 2010-11. It's not scored in 9/10, so okay. it would occur in the year that it's scored for.
Okay, so it is scored for next year.
Yes.
For a budget that we have not done yet.
Right, but in the special session back in February, the legislature did include the assumption of at least 4.
It got carried over.
Yeah,
which a lot of things got carried over, and certainly, 5 paragraphs in an 8-page memo is not a heavy amount of due diligence in terms of transparency to the legislature or to the public on the costs and benefits of this proposal. Correct? Is 5 paragraphs enough to obligate the state for a 20-year deal?
I'm not sure I can comment on that. I wasn't around for when the bill was passed. But
I'll ask one last question. So we have a governor who has 9 months left in office, and he's proposing to do a fire sale that will commit us to 20 years of expenditures. In terms of fiscal policy, I know you were very cautious in your statement that under normal circumstances we would never do this, that this makes no sense. And the only reason we're willing to consider it is because we're in such dire need, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I think the conditions, the fiscal conditions, should not change the facts. It either makes sense or it doesn't. And our economic condition, as you heard from a couple of my colleagues, in their thinking, and it's my thinking as well, should not play a role in whether we do something or not. It either makes sense for the taxpayer or it doesn't. And I think in this case, from your analysis, notwithstanding your conclusion of, maybe we need to look at this a little closer, it just doesn't make sense. If we're going to lose $500 million over 20 years, it doesn't make sense. So that just is pretty clear to me from looking over your analysis. With that, we have, thank you. Yes, Assemblymember Caballero.
I have one question that I haven't seen anywhere, and if I've missed it, I apologize. But we have a contract, or we're under a contract that the governor signed to put these buildings out to bid. What is our liability if we cancel that contract, or if it is not effectuated?
As far as I know, there would be no liability for stopping the sale. We did arrange for CB Richard Ellis to be the broker on the sale, and they would receive a very small percentage of the sale proceeds if a sale goes through. But as I understand the contract, if the sale does not occur, the state does not need to provide any of the funds to CB Richard
Very
Ellis.
good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Assemblymember Berryhill.
Just one more. These are all these buildings for $2.5 billion?
Yes, it would be all 11 of the properties.
Well, this is then we ought to put a group together, and as a business group, this would be the greatest deal in the history of California.
Thank you. With that, I'll invite our next panelists up. We have Perspectives for Los Angeles and San Francisco, Jerry Epstein, former chairman of the Los Angeles State Building Authority, and Don Casper, former member of the San Francisco State Building Authority. I think Tom is ready to start a consortium here.
I noticed they don't have the BOE building on this list for sale.
Yeah, no one would buy it. Okay, welcome. We'll start with Mr. Epstein.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my chief of staff and I flew up here this morning from Los Angeles at your invitation, and I hope that I will answer some of the points that you asked me to go to. I also hope that you will excuse me if I am extremely frank. Thank you.
We appreciate transparency around here.
Thank you. By introduction, I'm Jerry B. Epstein. I'm here this morning in my capacity as former president of the Los Angeles State Building Authority, on which I served without compensation since my appointment by Governor George Deukmejian in 1983. I am the last original developer of Marina del Rey, still above ground. It's the world's largest recreation boating community since it was created almost 50 years ago. For nearly 3 decades since my business success, I've been most happy and honored to serve the people of the city and the county of Los Angeles and the state of California to give back to the community. I'll interrupt myself. As soon as someone tells me how honest they are, I reach for my wallet. But in this case, this is true. I just want to give something back to the state that's been so good to my wife and I for so many years. In addition to my tenure on the Los Angeles State Building Authority, I've also had the opportunity and the privilege to serve as president of the Board of Airport Commissioners for the city of Los Angeles under then Mayor Tom Bradley. I was chairman of your California Transportation Commission under Governors Pete Wilson, and I was vice chair of the California High-Speed Rail Authority under Governors Pete Wilson and Gray Davis. If there's any common theme to my civic participation, it's that I've always tried to bring a private sector focus on cost-effective investment and long-term vision to the planning, construction, and management of public sector infrastructure at our airports, in our transportation system, and in the ownership of state office buildings. The Los Angeles State Building Authority has its roots in the gubernatorial administration of Ronald Reagan. It was established as a joint powers authority with 2 appointees by the governor of the state and 1 appointee by the local jurisdiction, in this case by the Community Redevelopment Agency of the City of Los Angeles. During Jerry Brown's administration, the identification of the site and planning for what became the Ronald Reagan State Building really began. In 1983, when George Deukmejian became governor, he really faced a decision about whether or not to proceed with the project. I was asked to join the Los Angeles State Building Authority. Governor Deukmejian could have looked at the matter from a purely political prism. Should the Republican administration expend state resources to spur the redevelopment of a rundown neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles to the benefit of then Democratic mayor and gubernatorial opponent of his, Tom Bradley? Instead, the question I was told to ask and answer was, did it make more sense for the state to own or to lease? If you believe in California, and God knows I do, the answer is obvious over the long term. It is better to own than to lease. And I'm a developer. I rental properties. Construction and ownership of the state office building would take the state out of the real estate business, eliminating the vulnerability to commercial property market and the inevitable real estate cycles and inflation. It's so simple. This was particularly relevant to the state entities which were to be housed in the state office building, the appeals court, the attorney general's office, the governor, and others, entities which constituted the very core of state government and which required courtrooms, hearing rooms, library facilities, and the like to carry out their functions. As a result, in the 1980s, the Los Angeles State Building Authority proceeded with the construction of the Ronald Reagan State Building. I'm particularly proud that its construction was completed on time and under budget. I'm proud of the beautiful, wonderful public space and the public art that was built in the building, and we received national awards for it. Everything in that building is first rate if you've ever visited it. Further, I'm thrilled that the Ronald Reagan State Building became a critical anchor in the renaissance of downtown Los Angeles. Once the Reagan State Building was opened, the legislature and the Wilson administration worked together to explore the further concentration of state agencies in downtown Los Angeles. Under a bill sponsored by then Assemblywoman and now Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard, the Los Angeles State Building Authority conducted a feasibility study to determine whether further consolidation made sense, and it did. Even after the Reagan building opened, the state of California had 75 different agencies in over 50 different rental spaces scattered throughout Los Angeles County. At about the same time, especially following our '94 earthquake, there were concerns about the physical condition of the Praia Junipero Serra State Building. It was located on this corner of First. As a result, the state determined it was in its best interest to carry out the renovation and the historic preservation of the empty and decrepit former Broadway store building. The Broadway store building, as you might or might not remember, those of you that are old enough anyway, it was a wonderful building that was more or less like a Bullock's or anything else at that time, or a Neiman Marcus. At any rate, the building was in a terrible state of disrepair. And this project we did build, and if I remember, it took us 3 months to empty the building out of the homeless and all of the waste that was there. I'm proud to say that that building also opened on time and under budget. The Joint Powers Authorities have been established throughout the state, and the approach has worked. Essential state functions are housed together, which provides effective space planning for the state agencies, as well as provides easier access for the people to their state government. Further, our state's independent judiciary system is located in a public-owned and not a private facility. That's important. The state agencies are located in buildings the state owns and at a lower cost of capital than the investment return which must be guaranteed to the private sector. After all the bonds are paid off, the state owns the buildings free of any payments for the land and improvements. As a result, I was skeptical when I first learned of the provision in last month's summer budget bills about the decision of the Schwarzenegger administration and the legislature to generate one-time revenue from the sale and leaseback of the Ronald Reagan and the new Junipero Serra buildings in downtown Los Angeles and other state buildings across California. I wondered how you all in Sacramento could come to such a momentous decision without even asking for the opinion of the members of the authority, which technically we own the buildings, and whose approval was necessary to implement the sale. When I think about it, I was fired by the Department of Public Services, which was my tenant. Where was the public hearing to air the philosophical merits of the issue? Where was the feasibility study to show the practical impact of the proposed sale? And what were the checks, what were the balances, just in case the transaction didn't turn out exactly as planned? Those of us in business know that doesn't always happen. In early February, I was visited by a delegation of 3 staff from the Department of General Services over a lunch which I hosted. We chatted about the proposed sale process in detail for the first time. It was explained to me that the sale was carried out pursuant to Assembly Bill ABX 422. Effectively, my judgment was neither sought nor desired, nor would the authority have any discretion. I was asked to convene a meeting of the Los Angeles State Building Authority for the purpose of retaining bond counsel with the intent to authorize the sale of the 2 Los Angeles State Building Authority buildings. 3 weeks later, the Los Angeles State Building Authority Council wrote our liaison at the Department of General Services the following, quote, "As we discussed prior to convening such a meeting, it is Mr. Epstein's request on behalf of the authority, which he chairs, that the Department of General Services prepare and provide to the authority and interested members of the public a complete economic analysis of the pros and cons of the proposed sale of each of the above referenced buildings," unquote. That's what our bond counsel wrote. The 3-page letter delineated my request that the analysis address a number of specific critical issues. For example, we asked for a comparison of the projected net proceeds from the sale of each of these buildings and the projected rental and other costs associated with a 20-year lease of each of the same buildings. The questions posed should have been asked and answered at a hearing much like the one you're holding now, Mr. Chairman. But during the budget process of 2009, the letter reminded the Department of General Services that the authority meeting requested by the Department of General Services and the information requested by the Los Angeles State Building Authority should be publicly noticed. We ask that the complete analysis be submitted to the authority in a timely manner. The February 27th letter did not indicate that I would oppose the sale. Rather, it stated as an authority member, Mr. Epstein has a special obligation not only to the bondholders but to the state and its citizens to take actions that are in the best economic interest of the public, unquote. The authority did not receive the economic analysis I requested, nor, frankly, did I schedule the requested meeting of the authority. I wasn't about to do it until I did have some of these questions answered. On March 20th, I received a first-class letter dated March 17th from Ronald Dietrich, Acting Director of Department of General Services. In its entirety, it read, quote, "This is to formally advise you that as March 17, 2010, I have appointed new members to the governing board of the Los Angeles State Building Authorities and decided not to reappoint you. Your prior services have been greatly appreciated." That's after 29 years. The administration's silence about the financial implications of the sale, to me, was deafening. I felt I owed it to my fellow taxpayers to try and tell the story of the proposed sale and my dismissal for seeking a public airing of the issue. I wrote an opinion piece published in the Los Angeles Times on April 6, which has generated an incredible outpouring of support for my views from around the state, not only letters and emails to me personally, but also TV news segments, print media stories, and newspaper editorials. I can tell you, and really, not that I'm so smart, but really, so many people, and I didn't realize so many people read the Los Angeles Times, but the outpouring in Southern California is just unbelievable. The Ronald Reagan State Bill, I'm almost through. I don't want to take more of your time than necessary. The Ronald Reagan State Building's bonds will be paid off in May of 2011. It's approximately a year from now. Even during this current unprecedented state fiscal crisis, it makes no sense to obligate the state to more than 20 years. Mr. Chairman, it's not just 20 years, it's more than 20 years of future market rate rent payments when the state will own the building free and clear before the end of the 2011 fiscal year. As a real estate developer, I can understand why investors have apparently responded so positively to the package. This gentleman, I think, hit it. Well, who was the gentleman that did it? Oh, Mr. Burial? He sure hit it. I can understand why investors have apparently responded so positively to the package of various state buildings assembled by the Department of General Services and its broker for sale. An initial 20-year lease from the state with periodic increases in rental income will provide an attractive 7% return on your money easily, several percentage points higher than the interest rates on the bonds the state has issued when it financed construction of the same state buildings. And the future prospect of even greater rent increases beyond 20 years. I'm also curious about whether the new private owners will be required to pay property taxes, a matter of great concern to the counties in which these state buildings are located. If they don't pay property taxes, you're going to have quite an outcry from the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles. Finally, it'll be important to understand what assumption the Department of General Services has used in projecting the cost of ongoing Department of General Services management of these buildings and compare those to assumptions utilized in the Department of General Services package for the private sector. That would be interesting reading. Bottom line, as a taxpayer, I cannot understand why the state would sell off these assets it will continue to use in perpetuity for essential and non-revenue producing state agencies. It simply makes no sense, in my mind, to eliminate approximately 3% of the state's deficit for the 2010-2011 fiscal year by obligating the state to pay future rent which will exceed the net proceeds from the sale in just a few years. The sale of the Reagan building would saddle the next generation of California taxpayers with escalating rent payments for no reason other than last year's short-term political expediency. I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your invitation to come here this morning, and I apologize if I've exceeded the available time, and I appreciate your patience. I've been stunned by the attention this matter is now getting, and there's obviously a larger lesson to be learned. I obviously believe the administration and the legislature should figure out a way not to sell these state buildings, but frankly, that's not all. Even more important, I hope you will all take to heart what I wrote to conclude my Times opinion piece, quote, I'm 86 years old, and I'm not personally concerned with having been fired. But I am concerned that we taxpayers may have no refuge from the poor judgment and dysfunction of our state government. Short-term solutions and accounting gimmicks like the proposed sale of state buildings have long-term consequences. The governor and the legislature should fix the state's budget problems we face through thoughtful, structural solutions, not carelessly conceived short-term political fixes that will cost us all money in the long run, more money in the long run. And thank you again for having me come here this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. I really appreciate you being here. Before I ask Mr. Casper to speak, I didn't do this at the beginning, probably should have been very, very clear. Of the 11 properties, the 11 buildings that we're talking about being sold, 7 of them have bond retirement in the next 5 years, which means that after those 5 years, the buildings will be owned free and clear, and we will be paying beyond that in terms of rent payments. The Attorney General building here in Sacramento, bond retirement 2015. The Cal EMA building here in Sacramento, it's state-owned already. The Justice building in Sacramento, state-owned already. The Harris building in Oakland, 2014. The Public Utilities Commission building in San Francisco, 2013. The Ronald Reagan building, 2011, May of next year. And the Radigan building in Santa Rosa is already state-owned. That's 7 of the 11 properties that in the very short term the state will own or already owns, and therefore will be adding on costs above that. With that, Mr. Casper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Don Casper. I was appointed to the San Francisco State Building Authority in September of 1993. I'm a lawyer in San Francisco, and for the last 10 years, I've also served as a member of the San Francisco Civil Service Commission and twice served as president of the San Francisco Civil Service Commission. San Francisco's merit system is the oldest west of St. Louis. It antedates the state civil service system by some 10 years. I've also served for 5.5 years as chairman of the San Francisco Republican Party. I did serve for 5.5 years as chairman of the San Francisco Republican Party, which is a little like being a missionary to Tierra del Fuego. But of course, I mean no offense to the good people of Tierra del Fuego. The 3 state office buildings in San Francisco which have been put up for sale are the Edmund G. Brown Jr. building, the Hiram Johnson building, and the Earl Warren building. With respect to the sale of these 3 buildings, I am in agreement with Mr. Epstein's conclusions because the context in which he has drawn for the construction, financing, and ongoing economic feasibility of the state office buildings in Los Angeles, that context can be translated to San Francisco. It's a very difficult thing for a San Franciscan to say, but it's true. The Edmund G. Brown Jr. building, which sits at the intersection of Van Ness and McAllister Streets, abutting Civic Center, houses the California Public Utilities Commission, the state's principal, or I should say one of the state's primary regulatory agencies, if not the primary regulatory agency, because it touches the lives of more Californians. The Earl Warren building, which fronts Civic Center, and the new Hiram Johnson State Office building, which rises 14 stories behind the Earl Warren building and which overlooks Civic Center, is home to the California Supreme Court, the State Judicial Council, and the administrative office of the courts. Those 2 buildings, called the San Francisco Civic Center Complex, thus are the home of the state's 3rd branch of government. Now, C.B. Richard Ellis, in its online brochure for the sale of the 11 state office buildings, has included for San Francisco a nice color photograph of the courtroom of our Supreme Court. When I first looked at that, I said, this would make a great hit piece in a judicial recall race, a court for sale. Now, Mr. Epstein and the Legislative Analyst's Office have presented searching and convincing economic reasons why these 11 buildings should not be sold. With respect to the 3 buildings in San Francisco, I would just like to make a plea, if that is what it is. Not based on economics, but based on government and what the purpose of government is. We hear a lot, especially from the Department of General Services these days, about the purpose of government is to provide services to people. The purpose of government is to govern. And if it provides services along the way, makes it even better. But it's to govern. And central to governance, the courts, central to governance, is a quasi-judicial regulatory agency like the State Public Utilities Commission. Now, should the state Supreme Court become the tenant of an insurance company, and insurance companies are major players in this commercial real estate market, should it become the tenant of some nation's sovereign wealth fund or a consortium of Wall Street investors, every decision rendered by the court as a tenant, that is, every commercial decision, will be searched for a conflict. How does it impact the landlord? How does it impact those with whom the landlord does business? Judges and members of regulatory agencies must avoid conflicts of interest. They must also avoid the appearance of conflict. Sale of these 3 buildings will present the state Supreme Court and the state PUC with the appearance of a conflict, all wrapped up, ready to go. Now, members of the San Francisco State Building Authority, members of the governing board of the San Francisco State Building Authority serve for 4-year terms with a maximum of 2 terms. So how did I serve for 16 years? I'm sure Mr. Epstein likewise was term limited. Well, we are so low on the food chain that Sacramento forgot about us until now. The San Francisco State Building Authority was never consulted about the sale. And as Mr. Epstein pointed out, the authorities are technically the landlords. You see, the state leased the land to the San Francisco State Building Authority. The San Francisco State Building Authority, in turn, built the buildings and gave and entered into a lease purchase agreement with the Department of General Services. So we lease the land, we are the master lessor of the land, and we own the buildings. I did some crude arithmetic when the plan was announced in the press. And mind you, it came to the attention of the San Francisco State Building Authority via the press. My crude arithmetic showed that it's cheaper to own than in the long term than to lease. Also, the 3 buildings in San Francisco include 1.2 million square feet, a little less. The State PUC building, the Edmund G. Brown building, 270,000 square feet. Its Civic Center complex, the home of the Supreme Court, some 912,000 square feet. Interestingly, in the Civic Center area, apart from those buildings, there is an additional 3.2 million square feet of commercial space. It's reasonable to assume that vacancy levels will hover between 10 and 15%. That's not enough to absorb the state agencies now housed in the 3 buildings. What's the point of that? Mr. Berryhill was quite right. This is a great deal for a potential owner because that owner will have captive tenants. They have no place else to go. Now, I arrived at these conclusions and I committed the unpardonable sin of talking to the press. The SF Weekly, in a blog, carried remarks that I made starting on March 1st. On March 3rd, I received a letter from the acting director of the Department of General Services informing me that my services were no longer required. Then the Department of General Services had to do some quick footwork because it didn't realize that the reason why we were on there, that I was on there for 16 years, is that our bylaws provide for a 2-term limit. However, we continue as holdovers until replaced. The Department of General Services, at the same time, sent the same letter terminating the services of Stanley Moy, the president of the San Francisco State Building Authority, who had served for more than 16 years as well. Now, Mr. Moy had never publicly stated a position on this matter. And to my knowledge, he had never made his opinion known in private either. Why would he be dropped? The spokesman for the Department of General Services on May 4th let the cat out of the bag. He was asked by a reporter whether the annual meeting of the San Francisco State Building Authority, scheduled for Friday, March 5th, would take place. And he smiled and said, without a quorum, there can be no meeting. he was too cute by half. Because at that point in time, the Department of General Services hadn't yet realized that unless Mr. Moy and I were replaced, we could show up at the appointed time and place at the Earl Warren Building, and there would be a quorum of the San Francisco State Building Authority. And for whatever reason, the Department of General Services did not want to have a meeting at that time. They very quickly found two replacements who were sworn in either the evening of March 4th or the morning of March 5th. I attended the meeting of the authority because it had been publicly noticed and could not have been canceled on so short a notice. I attended the meeting of the authority and spoke during public comment to at least make sure that a different viewpoint was heard. That is not transparent government. Thank you.
Wow, where to begin? Mr. Epstein, so not only were you fired by your tenant, but you had to pay for their lunch first, too?
Yes.
This letter from Ron Diedrich to you, two-sentence letter. Dear Mr. Epstein, this is to formally advise you that as of March 17th, 2010, I have appointed new members to the governing board of the Los Angeles State Building Authority and decided not to reappoint you. Your prior services, 29 years? Is that 29 years? Your prior services have been greatly appreciated, period. That was the letter letting you know that you were no longer on the state board. And coincidentally, it was 3 weeks after you sent the letter to them asking them for the financial analysis?
I had requested, Mr. Chairman, I had requested 3 or 4 times to please, in a timely manner, get back to me, as did my counsel.
So on February 27th is the last letter that you sent to them, and on March 17th is when you were removed.
Yes.
It says, the letter says, I've appointed new members. So out of the 3 in Los Angeles, 2 of them are gubernatorial appointees?
Yes.
And so they removed the other gubernatorial appointee as well?
Yes, the other gentleman is Rusty Doms, D-O-M-S. He served with me for so many years. He and I have been involved in construction. He does the same as I. We've been involved with construction all our lives. I'm very active at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, where I was overseeing the construction of $500 million hospital. And he and I just concluded 5.5 years overseeing the development and the construction of the new USC County of Los Angeles hospital that was just opened a year ago. It's a $900 million hospital. Again, I'm not trying to tell you how bright I am, but I've seen the movie 60 years, so I don't have to be the brightest light on the street. This whole thing is just ridiculous. And I think you should understand it isn't just 20 years. As a developer, I can tell you, as God made us, and as the moon's coming up tonight, there's going to be rental increases beyond 20 years. I mean, just the whole thing is so ridiculous, and I just hope and pray that you gentlemen, you ladies and gentlemen, are going to be able to tell the governor. I saw him on TV, and he said that he's done very, very well all his life, which he has financially. And I don't know where he's come up with the rationale for this. He's certainly not a stupid person. He's a very bright individual. and it's just beyond me to understand. It's sort of a smell test. It just doesn't pass it.
So you were appointed initially by George Deukmejian.
Yes.
Continued under Pete Wilson, continued under Gray Davis, continued under Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
And you get a 2-sentence letter thanking you for your
but
service.
I think Don hit it. We're so low on that food chain, which I guess is good too, because they've never had any problems with us. I have always felt, again, that the idea of a state building authority, appointing people that have been in the industries, again, don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I've been in the business long enough to know that most municipalities that build have people on that authority that's going to oversee the building that don't know a floor joist from any. I mean, it's so that a general contractor usually comes in with a bid under his cost, knowing that he's going to get very, very rich on change orders. It's really that simple. Our business is really a very simple business.
Thank you. Mr. Casper, you were appointed, I imagine, you said you were
Governor
there.
Wilson.
Okay, so you were there, Wilson, Davis, Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
And you were given notification, and within a couple of days, they replaced you in time for that meeting.
Yes.
How many people were at that meeting?
There were about a dozen people present, and I am including 3 CHP officers.
Okay. So there were a dozen people at a meeting where the sale of 2 buildings that have an estimated value of $500 million was discussed.
Yeah, well, it was not really discussed either, in that it was presented to the newly constituted governing board by the Department of General Services as a fait accompli. No vote was taken. The Department of General Services made its report. The new president of the authority, who was my successor as chairman of the San Francisco Republican Party, gave his opinion. He agreed with the plan, and there was public comment by me, and that was pretty much it.
You were the only person to speak in public comment?
Yes.
So there's 12 people there, one person speaks up, and they go along with a sale of properties worth about $500 million.
Yes. The others who were there were state employees from probably from the Judicial Council, and of course they could not take a position.
Okay. Assemblymember Buchanan.
I'll be brief. I just want to thank both of you for taking time from your schedules to come up and testify today. And I also want to thank you for your many years of public service, because I'm one of those people that believes that public service is an honorable calling. And if government's going to work efficiently, we need people like yourselves who are well-qualified, successful, dedicated, who care about government, who care about the common good, and are willing to give generously of your time. And finally, I just want to apologize for the treatment you were given, because it's not appropriate. I mean, we've seen in the last year other agencies where people have been fired, replaced for disagreeing with administrative positions, and I think that's wrong. I mean, I think the public, whether I agree with your position or I don't agree with your position, I think the public deserves an honest discussion on issues, and ultimately that's how we're going to get to the best answers. So, please accept my apology and also my thanks for your dedication over the past decades.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Emerson.
I likewise would like to thank you for your years of service. And Mr. Epstein, I have a question surrounding the letter of dismissal and when the Los Angeles State Building Authority met. what was the timing?
Frankly, sir, I don't know when they met again. I think they met a week ago, but I'm not quite certain. And I was not asked to attend. I didn't want to attend, and my doctor advised me not to attend.
So what did your physician say about coming to No, that's okay. So there was approximately a month.
If I may, Assemblymember Emerson, we have a memo from DGS dated March 26th, 9 days after Mr. Epstein was removed, noticing a public meeting on Thursday, April 15th. So within a week and a half, they noticed a meeting in April.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you the obvious question, each of you in turn. Do you think this removal and replacement is a cover-up?
I think, Mr. Chairman, I said before, it just doesn't pass the smell test. Those of us that have been in business for quite a number of years, when anything comes to us, we usually take an awful lot of time, especially something that involves a tremendous amount of money. We usually spend an awful lot of time with the economic consultants. I know I do, and it's part of. I guess each of us has a formula, but it's just, in my humble opinion, it is unthinkable. If I read about it in a novel, I'd question the author. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It's just, and the funny part of it is, no matter what they sell it for, unless something goes crazy, I mean, how much of it is it going to solve for the tremendous problem that we have in this state? And I must also tell you that, again, from all of the calls and all of the inquiries that I've gotten in Southern California, people are really looking to see if the state, if the legislature can really countermand the administration, to see if this isn't a done deal. If all of us, I remarked to Mark Martin when we spoke, because I have been here a few times, I said to him, frankly, at my age, not that I'm infirmed, I'm doing well, but at my age, really, am I coming up here? Is it a dog and pony show? Am I going to get time to go on with this? And do you think it'll make a difference? And his words to me were so reassuring that I'm here. And as I say, I just hope that the legislature can convince the governor that this is absolutely the wrong way to go.
Thank you. Mr. Casper.
Mr. Chairman, given the removal by the Department of General Services of a quorum of the governing board of the San Francisco State Building Authority so soon before the long-scheduled annual meeting of the governing board, and given the accompanying press spin coming out from the Department of General Services, a reasonable inference could be made that the Department of General Services did not want there to be an open discussion and vetting of the sales. Now, press spin. The constant tune coming out of the Department of General Services has been that the state should get out of the commercial real estate business and do what it does best, delivering services to Californians. The Department of General Services knows how to build and manage buildings. The San Francisco Civic Center complex was budgeted at $264 million. It came in, as I recall, some $15 million under budget and on time, largely due to the work and oversight provided by the State Building Authority, but also by staff members, highly competent staff members of the Department of General Services, whom, I'm proud to say, are civil servants. Given this very odd spin, given the removal of a quorum on such short notice, it's plain that the Department of General Services did not want there to be discussion.
I thank you very much. I also want to give you a little more recognition for your combined 45 plus years of service on these state building authorities. Thank you so much. This conscientiousness that we're seeing here, this concern for the taxpayer, is what we need across the board in all government, and certainly in state government. This committee meets twice a month, and we do this twice a month. We look into expenditures and programs and try to find savings and efficiencies. So it is always comforting to us to see people who are out there on a day-to-day basis doing what we're trying to do here, which is to try to provide value for the taxpayer. You can't do the services unless you're being as efficient in your day-to-day expenditures and in your day-to-day management as you can be. And I think based on the executive orders regarding state real estate issued by both Governor Pete Wilson and Governor Gray Davis, that state real estate policy should be based on the principle that owning state buildings was preferable to leasing them. This is state policy under two governors preceding this one that we are unraveling, that is entirely consistent with your testimony here today. I again value the service that you've given, and maybe in 9 months you'll be back, not in front of us, but back in your state authorities to provide that wise counsel, looking out for the taxpayer dollars. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Our next witness, we have invited Fred Aguiar, the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Governor's Office, who oversees DGS, and we were told yesterday that in lieu of Mr. Aguiar, Laura Zuniga, Deputy Secretary of Legislative Affairs for the State and Consumer Services Agency, was going to be here. I would have thought that in lieu of Fred Aguiar, maybe Mr. Diedrich, is that his name? Who wrote the letter to Mr. Epstein. That would have probably been a good substitute, but I hope that you will be able to answer our questions. If you want to start with your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. I'm Laura Zuniga, Deputy Secretary for Legislation for the State and Consumer Services Agency. As requested, I'm here today to discuss provisions in the current budget approved by the legislature and signed by the governor that provided for the sale and leaseback of state office buildings, and to provide a general overview of the authority. As the committee knows, we are currently in the process of evaluating bids for the 11 properties the state is authorized to sell. The Department of General Services is reviewing bids and performing their due diligence to ensure that any deal entered into would be in the best interest of our state. Because we are in active negotiations, we cannot comment on any specific details of the bids or bidding process. DGS did report on Friday that we have received more than 300 offers on these 11 properties, with multiple bids exceeding $2 billion. We are more than pleased with the competitive offers that have been submitted and are looking forward to proceeding with the next step of the negotiation. With the proposed sale, the state positions itself to pay down more than $1 billion in bond debt, save approximately $400 million in interest payments, lock in stable lease rates, and lose some of the risk that comes from owning and operating real estate. I would like to emphasize that until negotiations are finalized, we will not know the bottom line, but the state is anticipating completing a transaction that makes good fiscal sense and protects taxpayer interests. If the sale doesn't make good fiscal sense, we will not go forward with the sale. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know you had submitted some, but
Assemblymember Buchanan.
We've just heard from the independent LAO that basically in their analysis, it's clear that they don't believe this makes good fiscal sense. We've heard that prior both Republican and Democratic governors have said owning makes better fiscal sense for the state. We've heard from successful businessmen and developers that this does not make good fiscal sense. We've heard that it's to some extent questionable on a legal basis as to who owns the buildings and who ultimately has authority to authorize the sale. And we've heard that it could be bad governments in terms of the conflict of interest you have in private entities owning court buildings, for example. So could you please clarify your last sentence that you will go forward if it makes good business sense and define for me how you're going to evaluate that?
excuse me. Yes. Once the bidding process is complete and we know the final numbers, the Department of General Services will complete an economic analysis that will release to the legislature as part of the notification period. And at that point, we'll be able to determine what would be good sense. But we can't complete that until we know the final terms of the
What are your criteria
sale.
in the economic analysis? Short-term, long-term? What factors are going to go into completing that?
They'll compare the status quo of owning the buildings versus 20-year lease terms.
Assemblymember Emerson.
So there have been no economic analysis done at this point based on estimated dollar amounts?
We do not have a completed economic analysis, no, because we wanted to wait until we have the final numbers.
So I guess a good place for you to start would be to look at the LAO's report and see what they have done in terms of some of the specific buildings. They have 8 of the 11 yielding a net present value loss of $600 million. And this is at a higher level, a higher price than the one that was in the budget estimate that was given last summer, including a loss at the Franchise Tax Board complex of $127 million, the Capital Area East End complex loss of $145 million, and the Earl Warren and Hiram Johnson buildings in San Francisco of 121. Those are just the biggest ones. And the 3 where there's a net gain is a Department of Justice building for $15 million over the life of this. The Radigan building here in Sacramento, $2 million. And the Reagan State building in Los Angeles of $3 million with an M. So we get a whopping 20 million positive and 584 negative. That is under their analysis. So I think it's a good place for the department to start. I'm going to want to see your numbers. I will want to see your numbers in relation to what the LAO has done.
Okay.
In terms of this batch of buildings, why these 11? They have different bond retirements. Some of them are already state-owned, as I highlighted earlier. Some of them will be owned within the next few years. Some of them have very long bond retirement dates, different sizes, different locations. Why these 11?
The department's Real Estate Services Division reviewed a list of the state-owned properties, and these are the ones that they felt would provide the best return for the state if they were sold.
Based on?
Estimated value of the buildings.
So just raw dollar value of the building
I believe
itself.
so.
Was the fact that some of that you have multiple buildings in the same market brought into consideration? For example, you have 5 of them in Sacramento. You have 2 of them in San Francisco, 2 of them in Los Angeles, and 1 in Santa Rosa, which I can't imagine there's a ton of office space in Santa Rosa. Was that brought, the market effect in that particular market, was that a consideration?
I think they considered certainly the markets where the buildings would be offered, but again felt that these would provide the best return out of our portfolio.
Let's go over the actual terms. I want to clarify that we have the terms here correct. A lease term of 20 years, we've talked about that. Lease rates automatically increase by 10% every 5 years. In addition, rates could increase annually based on inflation. Is that correct?
Yes, there is in the memorandum of offering, there is the lease terms are provided, and then there is also a provision for cost to go up, I think according to the Consumer Price Index for inflation.
So you have an inflation on an annualized basis, inflation adjustment on an annualized basis, potentially, and then automatically a 10% increase every 5 years?
Correct.
So you get both, not one or the other.
So you have 300 people interested in the deal.
Okay. Lease terms can be extended for as long as 30 more years in 5-year increments.
Yes.
So that could be a total of 50 years that we're paying rent for these buildings.
If all of the options were extended.
The state pays for gas and electricity and occasional painting and recarpeting costs.
I believe the owner would be responsible for all maintenance of the buildings except for energy utilities, according to the memorandum.
Okay, well, what I have in front of me is that the state pays for gas and electricity and occasional painting and recarpeting costs, while the private owner pays for sewer, trash disposal, water, and other property management services such as custodial.
From what I am aware, the owner is responsible for paying most of the building services, including management, maintenance, special repairs, insurance, and scheduled upgrades. The owner pays utilities with the exception of gas and electricity. But I'll be happy to confirm for that and get the information back to you, Mr. Chair.
So, I'm looking at a cash.
Investor packets.
It's the investor packet that was released.
Okay.
It says here, sub-item number 3, State of California to have premises repainted every 5 years and recarpeted every 10 years.
Okay, I'll have to get back to you on that, Mr.
Okay. Chair. So this isn't a turnkey operation. We're not just paying rent, showing up, and actually not showing up. We're already there. These are the buildings we already occupy. So we're going to stay there, pay rent, give them a 10% rate increase and an annual inflation adjustment, and we're going to paint and recarpet for them. Where is the risk for the potential landowner in this deal?
I think the potential for risk would be if there are major repairs that need to be done to the building, structural damage, or any repairs that could come up.
Major repairs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Assemblymember Berryhill.
How old's the building?
I don't believe they're all brand new, but I'd be happy to get back to you with the exact ages.
Because, I mean, if you've got a halfway new building, that's not much of a risk in my mind. I mean, heck, we're sitting here with there's hardly any risk if you're the guy buying this thing. In my mind, this is a pretty doggone good deal, Mr. Chairman. And I think we should put that consortium together, and this is a good deal.
To be clear, a good deal for the buyer, not for the state. As we sit here today, we aren't looking out for the buyer. At least that was my impression when I got elected and got sworn in.
This thing would appear to me that we are looking out for the buyer.
Yes, Assemblymember Buchanan.
Governments could probably have it become a revenue generator if they bought it from us.
Ms. Zuniga, the two executive orders that I just cited a minute ago, one by Pete Wilson, one by Gray Davis, that clarified and emphasized that the principle of buying was preferable to leasing. Has there been a change? Is there a new directive from this administration with regard to those executive orders?
Well, I think the current fiscal crisis, prompted new ways of thinking about how the state manages its real estate, if there's a way to unlock some of our value. So we tried to look at other opportunities to raise some revenue for the state.
Unlocking value is another term for a fire sale. You're selling assets that you have, many of which we own free and clear, and some of which we will own free and clear in the next few years, as I highlighted earlier, the 8 different projects. So can you give me a difference between unlocking value and a fire sale to get money in the very, very short term with long-term implications?
Well, the statute that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor required the sale to be completed if it was in the best interest of the state, and that'll be up to the Department of General Services to determine. It is not a requirement that the property be sold, but the option is there.
In terms of the market for real estate right now, it's my understanding that from talking to many folks who are in the commercial real estate business, that the mortgage foreclosure crisis that we have been through for the last few years is something that is hitting and will be hitting the commercial real estate market over the next couple of years for all of the same reasons. People who were locked in at higher interest rates, now we have less tenants, we have higher vacancy rates, and so the commercial real estate market is having a very, very hard time, and potentially could have some of the same defaults that we saw in the mortgage crisis. Has there been any analysis, any investigation into how that will affect this sale? Or are you just looking at what comes in and going from that?
Well, we did feel that this portfolio on the market would provide a good opportunity for investment because it is unique. As part of the review process of the bids that have been received, the department will do due diligence on the bids and on the offerings to make sure to check the buyer's ability to maintain the payments.
Now, we have focused on this 20-year lease term because that's the condition that was placed in the sale. Is DGS going to look beyond? If, in fact, you can have 5-year increment extensions up to 30 additional years, are we going to get an analysis that doesn't stop at 20 years but continues out 30, 40, 50 years so that we can see the true cost and benefits over time?
I believe our economic analysis will focus on 20 years, but we can look further than that before we provide it to the legislature.
I think it would be prudent if those are the terms that are in the lease, then we need to see what the potential is to go all the way out to the 50-year mark. In terms of the gentlemen who were here earlier testifying, what was the hurry in removing the 4 authority members? There was the meeting that was called on the Friday in San Francisco, and in the few days leading up to it, he was removed along with his colleague. And then in Los Angeles, 3 weeks after the letter requesting a financial analysis, the 2 gentlemen were removed there. What was the hurry? This is something that was authorized back in July of last year. You keep mentioning that it was approved by the legislature and signed by the governor. Why all of a sudden in February and March was there such a hurry to remove these people?
I couldn't say that we were in a hurry to remove the individuals. The director exercised his authority to appoint new members who would be open to the potential sale of the property.
Who would be open to the potential sale. So you had some indication that the board members were not open to it.
I think as the members indicated, some of the members made comments that they were not supportive of the proposed sale.
Okay, so you didn't like the result that you thought you were going to get and replace them with people who would give you the result that you wanted to get.
Well, I would say that because this authority exists in statute, and it's an option for the department to sell, we wanted people who were open to the possibility of the sale.
When in the case of San Francisco, Mr. Casper was a little unclear. When did the 2 replacements actually get sworn in?
I don't know the answer to that, Mr. Chair. I'd have to get back to you. I can't recall the day.
I would like the names of the 2 people who replaced the 2 sitting board members in San Francisco, and when they each were sworn in. By the hour, not just by the day, because it's pretty clear that it happened within a 24-hour period from when he was removed. I can't imagine you swore them in before he was removed.
I will get back to you with the information we have.
In terms of this committee, we will be making some recommendations here. We are 1 short, I think, of a quorum, but we will be making some recommendations here soon. Mr. Emerson.
Question, was the acting director, Dietrich, invited to come to the committee today?
Yes.
And he declined?
Well, I would say as my role as Deputy Secretary for Legislation for the State and Consumer Services Agency, it's part of my job duties to serve as the liaison to the legislature.
It is, I'll clarify though, it is not common for us to ask for a specific person and then not have that person show up. That is not the norm, Mr. Emerson.
No, my question has to do that the dismissal letters were written by Mr. Dietrich, and so I was curious as to how the acting director makes that decision in the agency, and I was just curious why he was not here to answer that question.
Well, I can tell you the 3 questions that we asked Mr. Aguiar in the letter that we sent him asking him to be here. Number 1, how did the Schwarzenegger administration develop the proposal to sell state buildings, including whether the administration consulted with real estate developers or other business interests?
As I previously said, our goal was to develop ways to unlock equity to get some cash now for the state, and we felt this was one avenue to do so. When developing the proposal, we contacted brokers to obtain information to try and arrive at estimated building values and estimated market rents. But we didn't talk to them specifically about sale leaseback. It was just about estimates of the property.
Can we have a list of the people who were contacted and communicated with?
I will get back to you on that, Mr. Chairman.
Number 2, the Schwarzenegger administration's rationale for selecting the buildings it has put up for sale and whether other state buildings were considered. You mentioned that the department felt that these were the most valuable assets, but were other state buildings considered, and why were they not included in the list?
again, I would say I think these are the ones that we felt provided the best value for the state. I think we looked at other ones, so other ones certainly were considered. One other factor was whether they were connected to our central plant, because I think there are some complications if we sold those buildings, but I'm not sure about the specifics of that.
Yeah, I would like to see a list of those that were considered and not selected, and why they were not selected.
I will have to get back
for
to
inclusion.
Mr. Chairman, if we have that information.
Number 3, the extent to which the Schwarzenegger administration considered the long-term cost to the state versus short-term gains. Again, not one-year time frames or 9-month time frames, but beyond, or not even 20-year time frames, going beyond that, including whether anyone in the administration conducted a cost-benefit analysis and whether such an analysis was ever presented to the legislature.
We provided to the legislature, I believe, the rough estimates we had on the buildings. We did not have a cost-benefit analysis because we don't have the final terms of the proposed sale. So when we have those is when we will complete the economic analysis, which will be provided to the legislature.
But that would only affect one side of the equation. That would only affect the benefit side of the equation. The cost side of the equation is static.
I think we'd like to have all the information before we complete the analysis.
But the cost side, whether at 20-year mark or the 30-year mark or the 50-year mark, you know what that's going to be because you have the terms. You have 10 years. You have 10% every 5 years. You have annual potential inflation adjustments. You have painting and recarpeting costs. You have that. It doesn't matter what the price is in terms of what the costs are. The benefit only the money coming in is only to offset that, and so there's going to be a price point at which it makes sense or it doesn't.
Right, and we need to know what the offset is.
Assemblymember Buchanan.
Unless, as was pointed out by the LEO, if a higher price could generate higher rents, So we don't. The base rent, I assume, is not set. We would have to negotiate that.
The memorandum of offering specified the lease terms. I believe
Did it specify
it could be
base
subject,
rent?
I believe, to final negotiations, but the memorandum did specify lease
does.
terms.
So they know what they're getting. So they're able. The investor is able to figure out how much they're going to get, and the taxpayer is not.
We don't know until the bidding process is complete what we will get.
Assemblymember Huber.
Yeah, what we're struggling with is this committee is charged with accountability and administrative review. We're trying to review ourselves the cost-benefit analysis the same way that the buyers are doing their own cost-benefit analysis. And if we don't have all the information, what I'm hearing from the administration is, well, we'll tell you when it's all done. We'll tell you when it's done and over, and then we can give you an analysis
If I
of
can
it.
clarify, I'm not saying that we will provide you the information when the sale is complete, but when we are done reviewing the bids and have selected a potential buyer, and then we know the final terms that would be offered to the state, but before the sale is complete.
Okay, I guess what I'm trying to flag for you is that we're going to ask those questions not just for the final bid, but as part of our oversight responsibility of having the same data that you have to judge which bid is the final bid, is doing that cost-benefit analysis and looking it out over a long period of time. Because is it a short-term cash flow for a long-term loss? What are we really looking at here? And I don't feel like I have enough information from the administration in order to be able to do the kind of oversight that we need to do in this committee.
Right. As I said, I can't release details of the bids or bidding process now, but once that is complete, we can provide a lot more information to the committee for your consideration.
I think it will be helpful for everyone to know how we came across this. Obviously, it was part of the budget last year, but again, 5 paragraphs of analysis leading into a decision. Page 7 of an 11-page bill that was assigned, and very little mentioned there because it was so focused on the Orange County Fairground sale that this was kind of thrown in. But the way this committee came to it was we were looking at the issue of office space that the state government uses throughout the state, and particularly the amount of space that is leased already, and where we are in terms of our capacity utilization of leased office space throughout the state. In other words, are we paying for rents for office space that we're not using up and down the state? And so when we were asking DGS for this information, we were told that on July 1st, we will get that information. On July 1st of this year, we will be told, based on an analysis that's being prepared, what office space is being leased and to whom, and how much of it is actually being used. Trying to get at the issue of, should we be shedding some leased office space where we're paying rent for nothing? According to to DGS, the state currently leases 16 million square feet of office space and owns 39 million. It's a ratio of about 70-30. So we own about 70% and we lease about 30. So that's how we came across this issue, was looking at the lease space. So here we are in late April. We still don't know, and we won't know till July 1st, what our utilization is on leased office space, yet we're talking about selling and leasing the same buildings that we currently lease. There's a disconnect there to me, that we are making decisions before we know what our capacity utilization is throughout the state on 30% of our office space. What is the latest on this analysis that DGS is preparing for July 1st?
That's definitely a fair question, Mr. Chairman. I don't know the status of the analysis. I'm not sure why the deadline is July 1st, but I will check.
It was in that same legislation. It was another sentence out of the 11 pages.
Right. Existing statute requires reports from departments on their utilization, and I believe the deadline is July 1st for
This was a new commitment on the part of the legislation.
I think it added to some existing reporting requirements, but I can see if there's any preliminary information we could provide you.
I think that would be imperative, because it would make no sense for you to come to us with some kind of a deal without that kind of analysis. It's putting the cart before the horse in those terms. So we had, I think, our quorum, and then we lost it again. With that, if there are no other questions, thank you very much. One last question. How many billion-dollar decisions does this administration undertake that don't have a cost-benefit analysis attached to them?
We won't make a final determination without a cost-benefit analysis, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have public comment. I know that we had a specific request to speak, so if you can, I suppose you can sit down here. Normally we just have you go up there, but
okay.
Anna's sitting over there.
I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Chris Thornburg. I'm a principal with Beacon Economics. We're an independent economic consulting agency based in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I'm also, just sort of as a bit of information, I'm also acting chief economist for the State Controller's Office. About 6-7 weeks ago, we were asked to perform a cost-benefit analysis on this land sale, and you'll have a copy of this report in front of you. It's called a bad deal, which kind of tells you what my thinking is about this. And you'll see quite clearly that the analysis we lay out is actually very similar to what the LAO has done. And our numbers are very similar in as much as we come up with a net loss for the state in present value terms of about $1.5 billion over a reasonable lease period of time, 30 years. So I'm not going to reiterate those points. I think they've been made quite clearly by the LAO. There's just a couple things I want you to think about in the context of this particular proposed transaction. The first thing is there's an interesting, obviously, market efficiency going on here, and that is to say that Ms. Huber, you had brought up what a sweet deal this is for a prospective buyer. And that's exactly right. In fact, the sweeter the state makes the deal, the more you're going to get for it. But in the long run, the more expensive it's going to be. So in a sense, there's a trade-off there, and the nicer the deal is. In fact, our numbers are a little different than the LAOs in as much as there's been apparently some cost shifts between the information we had and the current proposal that went out to prospective buyers. That does make it more lucrative for prospective buyers, but in the end will cost the state more in the long run by shifting costs back to the state. In a very real sense, I can say this, is that no matter how you set this up, this is going to end up being a bad deal for the state. And it's not because the commercial market is weak. In fact, quite the opposite. I've heard a couple statements being made about the weakness of the commercial market right now, and that's not the case at all. In fact, there was expected to be tons of commercial foreclosures, and that was expected to weaken the market substantially. But those foreclosures never arise. We had a change in the accounting rules at the beginning of 2009 that basically gave the banks the ability to not foreclose on properties, to renegotiate and simply hide these potential losses. As a result of that, there were these very large funds that were pulled together that were basically set up to go out and cherry pick foreclosed commercial units, and this money has been sitting on the sideline doing nothing. So, in fact, if you were going to sell these properties, this is probably a good time to do it because there's lots of frustrated cash, and you could tell by the number of bids for these properties how much money there is out there. Be that as it may, this is still a bad deal. And the reason is quite simple. When you shift ownership of a capital property, of a capital good, such as an office building, from the public to the private sector, what you are inherently doing is substantially increasing the cost of that capital. Understand that when you shift this to the private sector, you're doing three things. A, it's more expensive for the private sector to borrow than it is for the public sector because clearly the state of California is a much better credit risk than, of course, a private individual is, and that's going to be reflected in those well, yeah, fair enough. But nonetheless, even now, even with the issues we have, we're still a better credit risk than the private sector, than a private individual in the private sector. Number two is, of course, there are tax implications that are built into the cost of capital. Don't forget, when you own buildings, you're not making a profit. You're not taxed the way the private sector is. That is built into the cost of capital, and that is reflected in terms of these higher rents. That's compounds for the differential. And there is a third risk. We have to keep in mind that about a third of the rents are CPI adjusted. The other two-thirds have this sort of 10% every 5 years kind of structure to them. That does, in fact, pass off a lot of potential inflation risk to the buyer. If we were, over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, to go through it's a substantial inflationary bout, which is quite reasonable given the amount of liquidity the Fed has pumped into the economy, that would basically destroy the value of this transaction for a potential buyer. They are taking a substantial amount of risk, which would not be incurred if you continue to own and lease by yourself. You add it all up, and it doesn't matter how the structured deal, it's going to cost the state more in the long run, no matter what. Now, with that in mind, I will also say two things. Let's say, for sake of argument, that it wasn't actually going to be a worse deal for the state, that the long-run costs were going to outweigh the value of the sale in present value terms. I would still say you shouldn't do this sale, even if it was equal, even if there was full arbitrage or these things were equivalent to each other. Because, in a sense, this transaction, while it doesn't violate the law, the letter of the law of Prop 58, it certainly violates the spirit of it. Because more or less what we are doing, this is no different than the state issuing a bunch of bonds over a 20-year period or a 30-year period to cover current expenses today. We know Prop 58 explicitly prohibits that particular type of transaction because we know that that simply leads to a situation where you just kind of see pushing it down there and pushing it around the road until you end up in a Greece-type situation. You have some sort of major fiscal collapse. This is clearly exactly the same process as if the state was doing that. If they're issuing 20-year bonds and using the money to cover the budget deficit today. And the sweeter the deal for the potential buyer, the more that sort of comes out, the more the trade-off is. That we just shouldn't be allowed. And this is not a reasonable thing to do. And of course, on that same note, it is interesting in as much as if a corporation were doing this transaction by the basic accounting rules of accrual basis accounting, you would be required to put forward a net present analysis like the LAO and Beacon Economics has done. you wouldn't be able to ignore the long-run costs in the context of a budget. So that's all I really have to say.
I appreciate your public comment. This is public comment.
I can take a question or two. That's fine.
Make your own comment. Yes.
I'm interested in the presenter here says that he works with the controller's office, and I don't think the controller's office paid for this. I think this is another item.
No.
I'm not sure there's a clear-cut decision of who's doing this.
Yeah, no, this is public comment. It's not official testimony. Assemblymember Huber.
I'm not an economist, but I think it's worth this committee discussing some of the information that we've learned from this hearing, because it does raise more questions when we listen to public comment that indicates what we are doing is covering current operating costs by basically incurring additional long-term debt. And we wouldn't have this situation if the only thing being proposed was selling surplus property or property that's being underutilized, or trying to deal with the fact that we don't need particular space for our current operating expenditures, because then I don't think that any of these issues would be raised, because it's not something necessary for continued operation. It would be vacant space, surplus property, and I think that's what most people think of when they think of the state unloading some of its assets, is if we're holding on to surplus property, then we should be selling that property because we don't need it for the state operations. But this is the case of buildings that we actually need, and that we know are going to cost the state more in the long run if we just sell the building and then try to rent it to ourselves, have them rent it to us, and incur all these additional risks, because it's always better to own your own property than to be subject to a landlord. And that's what we're facing here. And I think that we should continue to do follow-up on this topic as more information becomes available from the administration, because it's our job to do that kind of oversight and really answer those questions. We're talking about taxpayer assets. It is not just the state of California in a vacuum, but we owe it to the taxpayers to guard these assets and our long-term risks just as much as we do any other budget item. So I want to thank the chair and the committee staff for working hard on putting this together, but urge that we continue to work on this.
Okay. Any other public comments coming? Okay. With that, perfect segue, Assemblymember Huber. We have some recommendations. We did that earlier. Number one, request that the Department of General Services provide a detailed cost-benefit analysis indicating costs and benefits for at least 30 years. I said up to 50, at the 20-year mark and the 50-year mark. With what if we do 20 in each decade, or 20? Okay, 20, 30, 40. Okay. With the information it provides the Legislative Budget Committee when it submits final details of its proposed building sales, even if the department chooses not to sell the buildings. Requires ABX 422 requires DGS to report the terms and conditions of the transaction 30 days prior to executing the transaction, which we discussed. Number two, request that the Department of General Services conduct a cost-benefit analysis of each of the buildings directly under its control to determine if the state could benefit from the sale of any of its buildings. In addition, request that the Legislative Analyst's Office review the DGS analysis and provide the legislature with any comments and recommendations regarding that analysis. And number three, request that the LAO conduct an analysis of operations and maintenance costs. This is something that we discovered quite by accident as we were looking at the different numbers for these buildings. Some of the O&M costs are completely out of whack from the rest. And there's no explanation at this point of why that is. Good management, good oversight would yield some answer for that to try to get that under control. So have the LAO conduct an analysis of those costs and provide recommendations to the legislatures on how to cut costs in state buildings on the operations and maintenance side. And I was going to add one more, which is out of an abundance of due diligence on the part of this committee, I think we should introduce legislation, a committee bill, that would stop the sale of these 11 buildings. As it's going to take a while to move through the process on a parallel track with whatever's going on at DGS. So that would be those 4 items.
I would take the three first and then the fourth.
Okay.
And on the fourth, I've not read anything that leads me to believe that this is the right way to go, or that we should be proceeding. But I would say, at a minimum, we should author legislation that requires final legislative oversight and approval to sell them, so that we actually have responsibility for taking a look at the numbers and approving the sale.
I'll ask. We'll do the first 3. We'll vote on those as a block, and then the fourth one we will vote separately, and we will work with staff. Will work with all of the members to craft the exact language, but it will be a committee bill. Okay. So on the first 3 items, a motion. Second. Okay.
De la Torre.
Aye.
Strickland. Arambula. Berryhill. Block. Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Fletcher. Huber.
Aye.
Jones. Lowenthal. Perez. Valines.
And on the recommendation for legislation to be drafted on the sale, opposing the sale.
I would move the second recommendation.
We have a motion and a second. Call the roll.
De la Torre.
Aye.
Strickland. Arambula. Berryhill. Block. Buchanan.
Clarify what legislation you're drafting.
We'll draft legislation that opposes the sale, and whether it says that the legislature gets final approval or ends it, that will be determined based on talking to the members.
Okay, so you need a motion to be able to draft that. You can't draft that through direction and come back to us.
We're authorizing staff to go ahead and draft something up.
Mr. Chair, a question. It seems that we're asking for all this information to make a decision. We're going to just introduce legislation to stop the sale. It just seems those 2 positions seem inconsistent.
Because it takes a while to prepare legislation, and it takes a while for it to move through the legislature.
I've seen us prepare legislation very quickly in this House. But
no one here is the speaker or the pro tem who can do that kind of magic. Okay, continue.
Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Fletcher. Huber.
I'm going to make a conditional statement first. I don't actually think you need a motion to draft it. I am going to vote aye, but not committing on the language until I have more information about the cost-benefit analysis. But I do think that it is prudent to have a backup plan. So drafting the legislation I don't have a problem with, but that doesn't commit me to sign on to the legislation until
Absolutely
I see what it looks like.
It never does.
Jones. Lowenthal. Perez. Valines. Block for the first 3. DGS provide detailed analysis. DGS conduct analysis, cost benefit of each building, and LAO to conduct analysis.
Black eye.
Black eye. Block for legislation bill. Aye.
We will keep the roll open for 10 minutes. Other than that, we are done for the day. Thank you very much.